In today's world, people feel lost in a sea of ideas. Which ones should we accept? Stay tuned because you're listening to Veracity Hill, striving for truth on faith, politics, and society. Here is your host, Kurt Jarris.
Well, a good day to you, and thanks for joining us here on another episode of Veracity Hill, where we are striving for truth on faith, politics, and society. So nice to be with you here in studio. The Roland VR50 HD is here. Defenders Media has acquired a new addition to its tech department, and it's a very fine, top-of-the-line video switcher we're very excited about. There is a learning curve, and I'm told on today's program our video resolution is going to be a little bit down because we've got to get one more cord. But Chris is the tech master, and he's back in studio today. Last week, Rob filled in for him and did a fine job. And today is Blooming Fest in downtown West Chicago, so I don't know if our mics will pick up people having the conversations out on the main street here in downtown West Chicago, where we are located. So we're very excited for today's program and the future of the production of our show with the new tech edition. And so hopefully Chris will be able to manage that, and we might check in with him towards the end of the program today. So this morning I had the opportunity of running a 6K in Wheaton, Illinois. It was a 6K instead of a 5K because we ran, or some walked, 6 kilometers, because that's the distance that a child has to walk just to get clean water for their family in parts of Africa. And so we're raising awareness, and our church raised $7,000 for that. There were a couple folks that went above and beyond the call of duty and raised money for that goal. And so it was a lot of fun. You can see me there on the screen, very sweaty. It was the first time I had run a distance like that since high school, actually. And so I was exhausted, but I ran the whole way. And so I was very thankful that I could still do whatever that was, 3+ miles, not quite 4 miles. So, yeah, it was exhausting, but it was good. And if you are interested in learning more about that, we can post a link at our website about World Vision and today's event. It was something like 60,000 people across, I'm not sure if that was the country or the world, were going to be walking and running to raise awareness for that. So that was a lot of fun. The internet was taken by storm this week by Laurel. And so, Chris, I don't know if you heard anything, Yanni or Laurel.
The clips that I heard of it were definitely sounded like Laurel, but I think it was a frequency thing based on how it was EQ'd or what the speakers were coming out.
Yes. The
underbed of it sounded like Yanni, even though it sounds to my perception like the narrator, voiceover artist is clearly saying Laurel. Yeah, his background noise makes it sound like Yanni.
So I was reading a couple articles on this. Yeah, it was pertaining to the frequency. It was a recording of an audio on a dictionary of someone saying Laurel. So it was a recording of a recording, and then I think it was, I don't know if they had manipulated the EQ after that or not, but that's really what it came down to. But it was strange because I heard Yanni the first couple times, and then I started hearing Laurel. And so I don't know if there were just different recordings out there. I'm not sure what would explain that, but at any rate, so the internet was taken by storm by this. These are first world problems. We're talking about clean water, for families in Africa, and here we are debating over Yanni and Laurel. So that's really something. At any rate, so on today's program, we're going to be talking about classical theism. And classical theism is sort of a label that can cover a broad spectrum of doctrines. So today we're going to be talking about these doctrines. And joining us on the program is the Assistant Professor of Philosophy and Theology at Southern Evangelical Seminary in Charlotte, North Carolina, Dr. Brian Huffling. Thank you so much for joining us on today's program.
Well, thanks for having me. I appreciate it. It's good to be here.
Yeah, and so, Brian, so tell me, I'm reading over your biography here, and you've been involved in various types of ministry, so 2 American churches, but also 2 Korean churches, and that piqued my interest. Could you tell me a little bit about that?
Sure. So when we moved to Charlotte, my wife and I moved from Tennessee after we graduated from college. And she was insistent to apply for this youth pastor position that I didn't really want to apply for at the time, because I just didn't want to be in ministry at all at that time. And so I applied for it, and it wasn't advertised as a Korean church. And we went there, and lo and behold, it was a Korean church. And ended up getting a job and working there for 2 years. Loved it. It was a great place to be, great people. Fell in love with the kids, the adults, the Korean culture. And then went and worked several years later for another one for a while. And we just really enjoyed the youth age folks being in youth ministry. It's just been really, really fun for us to do that.
Yeah.
And it was enjoyable to learn a different culture.
Yeah.
So it was American. They would speak English, and it was Americanized. I mean, it was here in the United States, in Charlotte, but it was just a Korean culture. But it was a lot of fun.
Interesting. So I'm sure you were able to taste lots of different foods during potlucks, and
we did. They actually ate every Sunday.
Oh, amen to that! Wow, my pastor would love that. I would love that.
Yeah, they would cook food, have a whole shindig right after the service.
Wow,
all kind of stuff. And so yeah, every Sunday.
Yeah, well, that's my view of the Eucharist. I am kind of opposed to the very ritualistic tendency that has happened in church history, but having meals together, that's where it happens.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, so that's great. Now, you also have quite a bit of military service, too.
That's right. I was a reservist in the Marines for 3 years. And then when I went actually transferred to the Navy to go into intelligence, but I transferred right before I started seminary. And I didn't want to get activated while I was in seminary, and so they let me go into the individual ready reserve, which is an inactive status. But in seminary, I wanted to become a chaplain, so I had to check that out. I didn't want to be on a boat for months and months at a time, so I decided to go in the Air Force. I heard the quality of life was really good, and it was fun, and it was everything. So I did the chaplain candidate program with them for about 3 years. And then I've been with the Air Force chaplaincy. I served 3 years at Seymour Johnson in North Carolina, and I've been at the Air Force Academy in Colorado for about 5 years now in the reserves.
Yeah, nice. And through all these experiences, you've had a strong interest in philosophy and theology and thinking about God, and that led you over to Southern Evangelical Seminary, where you've been pursuing degrees, and you found yourself and end up teaching there.
That's right. Yeah, I really started off in interest in apologetics, and being at SCS for just no time at all, it was obvious with folks like Norman Geisler and Tom Howe and different professors at Richard Howe that if you're going to do apologetics well, we think that you need to do philosophy well. And so we brought that in and then started adding that as a major and everything. And so yeah, that's been an important part of the SCS experience.
Yeah, nice. All right, well, let's get to the main topic of today's program. So we're talking about classical theism, and as I briefly mentioned, it's kind of a label that's used to cover various different doctrines about God and who He is. So if you had to explain what classical theism is, in a broad sense, and I'm sure we're going to get to more specifics throughout the program. But how would you broadly describe what classical theism is?
Well, classical theism is the label that we normally give to the historical, traditional, orthodox view of God that's come out of church fathers and the creeds. And classical theism upholds the traditional doctrines like God is simple, doesn't have parts, that he doesn't change. He is not inside time. He's timeless. He is not affected by creation, so he's what's called impassible. And he transcends all of his creation. He's not part of his creation, and he is distinct from it. This is in distinction to the view that God does change, more or less like process theology. That God changes. He's in time. He's affected by his creatures. And so a classical person like me would a lot of times say there's two views of God, a classical view of God and a process view of God. Classical means he is timeless and all that, doesn't change. The process is that he's in a process of becoming something, changing in some way. He's somehow inside or temporal, inside of time. And so that's the historical traditional view of God is
sure.
pretty much just what's called the classical.
And help someone like me out. So under this view, this is where some of the main omnis would be located, right? So that God is omnipotent, he's omniscient, omnipresence, and omnibenevolent.
Right.
That would fall under this sort of big tent, if you will, of classical theism.
It does. So we would say God is omniscient. He's all-knowing. He's everywhere. Now, people who aren't classical will oftentimes still uphold things like omniscience, that is, that God knows all things, but they redefine what it means to know and what can be known. For example, the classical theist would say God knows the future. He doesn't have a future, but he knows our future. A non-classical theist would say things like the future isn't a thing to be known yet, so he doesn't know it. And so he kind of learns as the future unfolds, so to speak.
Huh. I see. Interesting. And I'm sure, I mean, in the Calvinism-Arminianism debate, there's often a discussion of what constitutes omnipotence, right? And so maybe there is room for disagreement even among classical theists as to what would properly qualify as those omnis. But there still is a border, it seems, that at some point one begins to go outside the bounds of classical theism. And I know maybe this can be a very complex question, but what might be some, symptoms that someone has gone outside of those bounds?
Well, the more subtle symptoms, from what we would say, is if someone starts talking about God being in time, if they start about God changing in some way, that means that God's learning. So if he's temporal, for example, I did my doctoral work on a philosopher named Richard Creel, and he is a major player in this impassibility debate. That is, that God can or cannot be affected by things, and he holds that God cannot be affected in areas outside of his knowledge. But when it comes to his knowledge, because the future is unfolding and new things are being learned, if he knows temporal things, like today is Saturday and tomorrow is Sunday, if he knows that, then he has to be temporal as well. So if he's knowing like that, or knowing temporal things or in a temporal way, that would be a symptom. Now, a more obvious and off the chart symptom would be something like Clark Pinnock, who would say that God is, we should think about God actually having a physical body. And so there's kind of a range of, we would see things like, in Christian evangelical thinking, we see people like William Lane Craig, for example, who wants to maintain that God was eternal but became temporal at the moment of creation so he could relate to creation. That's not oftentimes seen as off the radar as much as, say, Clark Pinnock, who says that God can be seen or should maybe be thought of being a physical being, since the Bible seems to describe him in that way. So there's definitely a range here.
Yeah, and for some it seems like there's a radar or something, if you will.
Right.
And I was going to ask you about William Lane Craig, because I took his philosophy of religion class back, so many years ago, and I remember he drew some distinction regarding impassibility, so the idea that God cannot change, but that God changes with regard to his relations.
Right.
I don't know if you would call that sort of like soft mutability. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, see, we don't make it as a classical theist. If God changes in any way, that's going to introduce the possibility of changing. And if God has the possibility of changing, then he has a kind of potency, which is a part of his being, which means he is put together of parts. And that's an issue I think you'll talk about later. But we would just deny God changes at all, because he doesn't, I think Craig calls it extrinsic and intrinsic changes, where he does change with his relationships, and he does outright deny impassibility. But if we hold that God is passible, that is, he's changing or is affected in some way by his creation or creatures, then he's necessarily temporal and changeable, which would just be a denial of classical theism altogether.
Interesting. And now we also have the area of, say, omniscience.
Right.
The traditional view is that God knows all things, and by that, historically speaking, philosophers and theologians have said that that this includes not just all future possibilities, but the actual future. I mean, what will come to pass, God knows. And there, especially in the last, say, 20, maybe 30 years, there's been a movement called open theism, which has called into question chiefly that belief that God knows the future, or how he knows the future, or that there are future facts to be known.
Right.
And so even in open theism, there are sort of different strands. But the traditional view, how would the traditional view respond to the broad camp of open theism?
Well, we would emphasize again that, well, open theists, their first problem that they oftentimes bring up is that our view, that the classical view, is based on or rooted in a quote-unquote pagan Greek view of God, because we'll oftentimes point to people like Plato or Aristotle, who can be seen as predecessors of classical theism in the thinking of, say, Augustine, Anselm, and Aquinas, three of the chief classical theists. And so they want to say, well, if you're going to go back and root your thoughts in Plato and Aristotle, then that's just pagan thinking. So we can't start there. We got to start with the Bible. And so we would start even more fundamentally, or more in a more foundational way than just their views. Is that's why they want to reject our views. And that's just a case of what's called a genetic fallacy. If something's not right or wrong because of where it starts. And we would just respond by saying that there's no monolithic or universal view, even in Greek thinking, really on anything, but even when it comes to God or the gods for them. The gods for them were also very passible, very material, very temporal. And so if it's going to go against our view, they'll go against their view as well. But we would want to also say, they say that we can't start with philosophy, we have to start with the Bible. But really we have to start with reality, because we read the Bible in the context of what we know about reality. The Bible doesn't tell us what a garden is. It just says God made one. So it assumes we already know what a garden is, for example. And so we have to understand that we do come to the Bible with these philosophical categories and notions. And so we want to start there and say we're doing exegesis, but we're also having a philosophy of nature, because all we mean by philosophy is our views of reality, knowledge, and all that. We can't not do that. But more specifically, when it comes to saying things like God doesn't know the future, that's correct depending on if you say God doesn't know his future, because he doesn't have a future for a classical theist. God is simultaneous in his existence. He doesn't have a past, present, or future. We can say God knows our future, because the view that they are espousing, and this kind of goes into this Calvinism Arminian thing that you mentioned earlier, God does not, in a sense, look down the corridors of time in kind of a reactive, passive way for a classical theist, because God is the cause of all being other than himself. He doesn't know things by looking outside of himself. He knows all beings and all effects of his causation because he is the cause. And since he knows himself perfectly, he knows that he's causing these effects to be. He didn't just cause them and then let go in kind of this deistic fashion of God wound up a clock and let go of it. God is actively causing us to keep being in existence even now. And so since he knows himself perfectly, he knows his effects perfectly. So we can know to us what is going to be our future, even though for him it's just simultaneous with his own existence.
One can get the impression that a lot of these beliefs and doctrines are interconnected.
They are. That's why when you start chiseling the foundation, you start eroding everything that's based on that foundation. That's why we are so emphatic that we start with the notion of things like God not having parts, not being put together of things. Because if he's put together like a set of divine Legos, then something has to put those divine Legos together. Well, once you say that God has these kind of parts, you have to start saying, well, then who put them together? What does it mean to be put together? And then we have to start admitting, well, maybe God can change. Maybe God is in time. He can be affected. But then we start describing what looks more like a creature than the transcendent creator. And then we start making God to be more like us. As Norm Geisler's book says, created... what it is man the measure. It's like we're making God to look like us, as opposed to recognizing that, no, God's nothing like us. We're created in his image, but we're very different from him.
It, in some ways, though, it can be a struggle to use human terms to describe the divine. I mean, after all, we are just humans, and so to a certain extent, we do find ourselves in these quandaries where we want to describe, for example, the time before time began to exist.
Right.
And that just doesn't really make sense, right?
Not if you put it in that category, right? Yeah.
Yeah. So, I could certainly understand how, to a certain degree, where God just begins to look more like us, but at the same time, we're limited on the words and ideas that we have.
Right, and that's an excellent point, and that's one of the foundational aspects of this kind of discussion. This is normally just called God talk, or if you want the big fancy term, it's called religious epistemology, how we know about God.
I have never heard that term, but that's great.
Yeah. Well, epistemology is a study of knowledge, so religious epistemology is a study of how we know about God.
Okay, yeah.
But you're hitting the nail on the head, man, when you're saying we have to use human language, because this is really the issue when we start talking about God, because we really don't have an experience of Him the way we experience trees and children and basketballs and squirrels, these kind of things. We don't experience God, but it's how we're made to experience and know is through our senses. We don't sense God. So God has shown us we can know about Him through His effects. Romans 1, we can know certain things about His divine nature, eternal power through what has been made. But we have to recognize, as you've already said, and rightly so, that our language we have to understand that our language only approximates God's being. And if we notice, these terms are mainly negative. If we say God is immutable, it means He's not changing. Eternal, He's not temporal. Impassible, He's not affected by His creation. Infinite, He's not limited. So a lot of what we say about God is, well, He's not this, He's not that. What is He? We don't really know what the infinite being of God is. We can describe it and chisel away what it's not. But we as finite creatures really don't know what infinite being is.
It's if I'm remembering the term, wouldn't that way of speaking about God be via negativa?
That's right. Via negativa, way of negation, or sometimes it's called apophatic theology, theology through negation, or negative theology, saying what God is not. And it's not bad to do that, because when you say, well, it's not wrong to say, well, God's not physical. He's immaterial, and He's not physical. It's correct to say He's not physical. But we just don't have any direct knowledge, and even if we did, we're finite beings. We can't comprehend what infinite being is.
Right. All right, we've got Tyson here who's following us on the live stream today. Thanks for tuning in, Tyson. And he's wondering here what your theory of time is. And I think you've talked about that a little bit. But if you could describe it more, I guess, succinctly, what would you say your theory of time is? Okay.
When someone asks that, they're normally probably looking for an A or B answer. So the views of time today are normally expressed in an A theory or B theory, where an A theory normally means they mean past, present, and future, and the B theory is there's no past, present, and future. This would be more along the lines of what Einstein held to. If everything is simultaneous, we can talk about before and after. Like this podcast is after Abraham Lincoln. But it's really on the time continuum happening simultaneously, but it's happening in a sense after, not in the sense of temporal after, but just sequentially on this kind of temporal map, as it were. Whereas an A theory holds, we can talk to a past, present, and future. At SCS, we're very unique in that we don't tend to follow the typical conventions of the way things are going nowadays. So I follow the Aristotelian notion of time that just says time is a measurement of change. So there's no such thing as, say, a minute, a second, a day, a year. Yeah. There is such a thing as planets revolving around the sun, and we just call that revolution a year, or rotation on the Earth's axis a day. So we would say that an inch or a foot literally exists. You're not going to let us and trip over an inch. Maybe you trip over an inch of concrete, but not an inch of just nothing. And so time itself is nothing either.
So time is sort of it's man-made. It's a measurement to help us in a sense, even just live our days because, like you said, when you take you recognize planetary rotation and you can divide the time, if you will. You could divide the... how would you describe it without saying time? You can divide the experience...
Duration of change.
Good. Duration of change, yeah.
But still duration, time, still using synonym for it. But yeah, I see what you're saying.
Yeah, the extent of...
amount of change, maybe?
Yeah, right. And so just as you divide that more and more, you get down to the clock going tick, tick, tick,
right.
tick. So it's not as if seconds exist out there somewhere.
Right.
But that a clock just measures things. And so,
right.
So you would say that time doesn't really exist, out there somewhere.
Yeah, it's not a thing that is. It's just the way we talk about things changing. So if I say the Earth takes a year to revolve around the sun, well, there's no such thing as a year. There's no such thing as Saturday. So we call today Saturday. There's no such thing as Saturday. We just made this calendar, and we said this is the X day in this week that we're calling a week, and it happens to be now during this particular rotation on its axis and around the sun.
Yeah,
it's fairly conventional. Now, the temporal or the things that do change are real. Like the Earth really is rotating, it is revolving. You're waiting on me to finish talking and this kind of thing. I have to wait for certain things to change. But the way that we measure it isn't an existing thing. Just much like, again, measurement of the length of something, like a foot, doesn't itself exist. A foot of something exists, but a foot or an inch, as in a foot or an inch, isn't a thing. Except for the standard foot or the standard meter, but that's, again, arbitrary.
So that's kind of your theory of time. That time doesn't really exist.
Not a thing.
It's not a thing, but it's a measurement
right.
that we use, and it helps us to communicate things that have happened in the past, I guess you would say.
Right.
So would you then say that the A and B theories of time, that's not necessarily about measurement, though, is it?
Well, it can be, but what they tend to do is they make time into an existing thing. But it depends on the person. Even with, say, in the A theory, you've got different ways of looking at it. So you've got the A theory talks about a past. So if you think the past is if we're kind of, quote unquote, moving into the future, there's two ways to look at that. If time exists as a thing, we can say the past is getting bigger and bigger. That's called a growing block theory in A time, or the A theory. Or we can get into saying that we're kind of chiseling off more and more of the future. It's called a shrinking block theory. So even within these various theories, there's still sub-theories. There's all kinds of different ways to cash it out, and people differ on even their own theories. So it just depends on who you want to talk about, really.
Yeah. So there are as many theories of time out there as there are people.
That's right. There are a lot of them.
That can happen sometimes.
That does.
All right. Well, we've got some other comments here from folks tuning in. We've got to take a short break here. But after we come back from the break, we'll address some of these comments and some other questions I had about what might be some more technical aspects to sort of philosophical theology. So I'd like to pick your brain on describing what divine simplicity is, and maybe even the theistic personalism debate.
Okay.
I know that can be a little heady for some folks, but hopefully if you'll stick with us, we might be able to even just wedge just a little bit more of an understanding on these tricky subjects. So stick with us through this short break from our sponsors.
You're listening to Veracity Hill, striving for truth on faith, politics, and society.
Evangelical Christians are talking about hell. What if we believe what we believe because we've always believed it? What if the gospel is really a matter of life and death? We want you to open your mind, open your Bible, and rethink hell. At rethinkinghell.com, evangelicals look at what the Bible says about hell, putting conventional and controversial views to the test.
Have you heard of the Google Ad Grant for nonprofits? 501c3 nonprofit organizations can receive $10,000 per month in online advertising credit from Google, empowering you to share your message with the world. At Defenders Media, we partnered with Nonprofit Megaphone, an agency focused solely on Google grant acquisition and management. They got us approved for the grant and now manage ad campaigns, bringing hundreds of new people to our websites each month. If you are eligible, Nonprofit Megaphone will acquire and manage the grant for you for a month for free to see if they can help you too. Visit nonprofitmegaphone.com to learn more. Thanks for sticking with us through that short break from our sponsors. If you'd like to learn how you can become a sponsor of the program, you can go to our website, veracityhill.com. All right, Dr. Huffling, well, I didn't tell you about this segment of the show, and our questions, we need to come up with new questions, Chris. But we have a short segment of the show called Rapid Questions here, and it's a 60-second sort of little game here to answer as many questions as you can, and they're kind of just random questions about your life. And okay. So we'll get to know you a little bit better here. So I'm going to start the clock, and then I'll ask.
I answer in 60 seconds, or ask as many in 60 seconds
as many as you can.
Okay.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
Oh, gosh, if it were 60 seconds apiece.
Yeah, I got to take forever.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. All right, so here we go. What is your clothing store of choice?
Oh, gosh. We'll say Belk.
Taco Bell or KFC?
Taco Bell.
Where would you like to live?
I'm in Statesboro, Georgia, and it's very nice. I will stay here.
What's your favorite sport?
Golf.
What's your spouse's favorite holiday?
Probably Christmas.
What's your favorite movie?
Mine is, I like Bowfinger because it's hilarious, and A Few Good Men are very good.
Nice. Have you ever planked?
No.
Do you drink Dr. Pepper?
Yes.
Have you ever driven on the other side of the road?
Yes, not on purpose, maybe, but you could dodge something.
Okay. Oh, here's a new one. Did you hear Yanny or Laurel?
I haven't heard anything.
What's your inner milkshake flavor?
Chocolate.
Hokey Pokey, Electric Slide, or the Macarena?
Electric Slide.
Nice. All right, that's a good one. All right, thanks for playing that round of rapid questions. Excellent. So you're a Dr. Pepper lover like myself. Very good to hear. How frequently do you find yourself with Dr. Pepper in your hand?
I should. Not too often, but here lately I have had a few.
Well, I won't hold you at fault. I'm a frequent, I probably have Dr. Pepper a few times a week, I'd say. So, very nice. Good. There was another thing, too. What was it that stuck out to me? Your current location. So you're in Georgia, is that right?
That's correct. I'm in Statesboro, Georgia, where Georgia Southern University is.
Okay. Nice. How close is that to Tallahassee, Florida?
Tallahassee? I don't know. We're about 6 hours from Orlando. Tallahassee, northwest of there? I'm going to guess 4 or 5.
Okay. My wife is from Tallahassee, so we make some trips down there once a year, roughly. To visit her family. So
okay, nice.
Nice. Oh, I figured you were in Charlotte, but I guess I know SES has a very popular online program, so you probably do a lot.
That's right, and I do go up to Charlotte when I need to do online stuff. So I'm back and forth. We do that a lot. So yeah, it works out well.
Nice. Okay, so in the first half of the program, we talked about classical theism as a broad tent that included many doctrines, and sometimes there is room for disagreement on these doctrines, perhaps say on God's omnipotence and what that is like, maybe even views of God and time, that there's some room for disagreement, but that there are still some aspects when they begin to go further astray, you can see that there are problems. And sometimes then those problems are interconnected. There's a web of beliefs here and doctrines. We've got here Mark Phillips, who's asked if you could explain to listeners what divine, he's got a few here, divine aseity. So what is divine aseity?
Okay, so divine aseity just means that God exists on his own and doesn't require anything else to exist. That's really all that means. He doesn't rely on anything else besides himself. To be ase is to be self-existing. So aseity means that God is just self-existing.
And when I've thought about divine aseity, it's been in the context of apologetics. Sometimes people would say, well, who created God?
Right.
And so, well, that's the sort of question that just doesn't make sense, because you're not talking about the same thing I'm talking about.
Right.
When we talk about God, we're talking about a being that is not contingent but is necessary, that exists of himself. You could probably, again, explain the doctrine a bit better than I could. But it's interesting to see here how, while this can be a heady topic discussing classical theism, it has implications for the conversations that we have with everyday people who have never studied theology. And so by thinking about these things, reflecting upon them, it really can help us in not just edifying and learning more about the faith we hold, but in how we can reach people and answer their questions about our faith. So really important stuff. Okay, I want to pick your brain here about two things. So first, let's talk about divine simplicity. And you talked about it a little bit in the first half of the program, that God does not have parts.
Right.
So what is that? When we say that God is a simple being, what does that mean?
Well, it means, broadly speaking, that God is not composed of anything. We oftentimes think of, well, he's not composed of physical stuff like we are. No, we're composed of our skeletal system and different organs and skin. That's not what we mean at all. I mean, of course, we do deny that of God, but that's of course. But it means on the more metaphysical level, the philosophical level, we talk about metaphysical categories. Again, going back to Aristotle, we at SES, the philosophy department tends to follow Thomas Aquinas' philosophical theology, and that what I mean by that, his views of God as nature, which he really draws a lot on from Aristotle. And Aristotle says, well, for a being to exist, it has to be put together of various metaphysical parts, basically. So one would be your form and your matter. Okay, so form would just be the kind of thing that you are coupled with what makes you individual. So we would say you and I share the human form, that we have a human essence, but you and I have different matter, or we'd be the same individual person. So we're distinguished with our matter. So we would say God is not composed of matter and form. He's not composed of things like act and potency, where act, or to be actual, just means existing. So to be composed of this kind of stuff, you would have to be existing or be in act. And to be able to change, you'd have to have the potential, the potentiality, or the ability to change. Potential means power, from the word potens or potentia for power. So you have to have the power or ability to change. But again, those are metaphysical parts that are put together that require being put together by some other agent than the being in question. So we can have act and potency because we're put together from different beings. Our proximate cause would be our parents, even our efficient cause ultimately would be God. But so God has any kind of these metaphysical parts, and he requires a composer. And so we say God is not composed in any way, or he would require a composer. He would be composed and not be God. And so that's a real general, broad way of talking about simplicity, and that it goes a lot deeper. There are about 8 different categories. For example, Thomas Aquinas denies of God. It would be our essence is human, but we don't have to exist. You mentioned that we're contingent, God's necessary. We can talk about dragons, for example. Dragons, we can say, quote unquote, have a nature like leprechauns or unicorns, but they don't exist. And so they can have an essence apart from existence. But we say, for God, his essence is existence, or his existence and essence just are one and the same. So even there is not a distinction. There's these 8 kind of categories, for example, that Aquinas will deny any kind of composition with God, or we start getting into problems and saying God is really just a creature. And that's going to be, if you listeners want to read this, if you want some real fun reading, it's Summa Theologiae, or what looks like Summa Theologica or Theologiae, is in Thomas. And then go online and look at it for free. It's the third question on God, if they want some really meaty stuff to chew into, or if they want to go to, say, Brian Davies' book, the thought of Thomas Aquinas.
Interesting. And I was going to ask you, so what are some of the problems that find themselves working out in your perspective of a denial of simplicity?
Okay, this is a good question. Where I'm looking forward to, just got approval the other day that Richard Howe, one of our professors, we are going to have a panel discussion on this very topic at the EPS session of the AARSBL meeting in November with William Lane Craig and Steve Davis. There actually was a symposium on this very topic. If you want to listen to it, just go to William Lane Craig's Symposium on Simplicity, or go to Claremont McKenna College. And some of the things that they'll argue against simplicity for various reasons. And so your question is, what happens if you deny simplicity?
Yeah.
Okay. So if you deny simplicity, you have to affirm, and this is what I don't see a lot of people doing. They want to deny simplicity. They don't want to affirm what that denial actually means. Like, what if he's composed? What's he composed of? What does it mean for God to be divinely composed? Well, we would just say, ultimately, if God is composed, he's going to require a composer. He's going to have parts, and he's therefore not going to be God. And if he's made up of parts, you can't have an infinite being made up of parts. If you add parts together, you'll never reach an infinite being. So it would seem to encroach upon God's infinity and perfection in that regard as well. And he would somehow be limited. And so there are all kinds. He would just be limited. He would be composed. He wouldn't be the God of classical theism.
So
to put it succinctly.
How does this? I'm curious. In my doctoral research, I've been studying the view of original sin of guys that have had an Eastern influence. So what we might consider today Eastern Orthodoxy. Do the Eastern Orthodox, and I don't know if this is something that you've looked into, what would they say regarding simplicity?
From what I understand, Eastern Orthodoxy guys really don't like systematic theology. You probably can tell me more this than I can, say more about it. But the guys I know and talk to, especially from the chaplaincy in the Air Force, they don't like to systematize doctrines of God. They want to emphasize mystery over systematic theology. And so I don't really think there's a lot going on. I could be missing the boat on this completely, but I don't see a lot in the literature from Eastern Orthodox guys on this. There may be some that do like it, but for the most part, they want to uphold mystery over systemization. And so I don't hear a lot of the discussion on that from them, and that could be just my fault, not anything. I mean,
I've heard, and I haven't looked into it too much, but I've heard of this essence energies distinction. I don't know if that this is this field or not.
It is. I'm not overly familiar with the energies discussion.
Yeah.
I have to hear more of it in context. So from what I understand, it has to do a lot with the nature of the Trinity and what emanates from God and that kind of thing.
Yeah.
It would depend on how it's cashed out in some way. I don't know
Sometimes we might use different words, but really we're describing the same concepts. So yeah, it's good to hash those things out. Well, one area I know that, at least I'm pretty confident, I know that Eastern Orthodox and the Thomistic perspective would agree is on the issue of theistic personalism, or rather the rejection thereof. That's sort of there's this debate going on in the world between classical theists and theistic personalists, and it's a very difficult debate to understand. And correct me if I'm mistaken, and I certainly want to get your comments, but some of it has to deal with whether we might think of God as some being or thing that is categorized or categorizable. So, for example, we could think of Thor as the god of thunder.
Right.
But when we're talking about God, what we're really saying is that God is, and I'm going to use a term here that some critique, the theistic personalist critique, but that God is wholly other. So maybe you could help enlighten me and those that are following along with how to understand this debate. Yeah,
I think it's difficult to define what theistic personalism is, I think the term was used first by Brian Davies to describe the antithetical view to classical theism, as you've already mentioned. From what I can gather, it basically is a characterization of a position that says if we're going to think of God as a person or as personal, then he has to have certain characteristics. For example, he has to be able to relate to us, right? He has to be temporal, because if he's not temporal, the criticism is that God is static. He's not interacting with us, but people are not static. They're dynamic, and so they have to be somewhat temporal. We can't think of God as unchanging, because if you're going to be in a relationship, that requires kind of a give and take and changing. It could not require God to be impassible, again, because we would be affecting God, and he would be in this relationship. And so if this is where you're wanting to go, the debate is against whether or not to be a person or to be personal or to have a relationship with people requires certain divine attributes. And so the Thomistic classical guys want to say, well, God is simple, immutable, eternal, perfect, impassible, these kind of things, but he's still personal. Our critique of the theistic personalists is that when we say God is a person, we don't mean like Brian Huffling is a person. He's not a person like me. Now, of course, in Jesus' humanity, he's a person in that way. But God as a being is not a person like me. We have similarities in that we're created in his image. God has or is an intellect. He has a will. He has power and can cause, and we can have all that as well. But, and I think even Thomas has said that we use the term person because that kind of language comes out of the creeds. And it's not wrong per se, but we don't always mean
the same
person.
thing.
And it goes back to that language issue we discussed earlier with this God talk.
Yeah.
We don't want to say God as divine being is a person in the same sense that a human is a person. So we as classical theists will say, yes, God has all these attributes, but he's still personal and relational. It doesn't require God to be temporal and changing and passable in order to have a quote unquote relationship with us. And so a lot of this says, well, if you have an eternal being, he can't be personal. Now, is that the aspect of theistic personalism you're wanting to get at? I'm not sure if that's the area you're really wanting to get into or not.
Oh, well, I mean, I'm just asking. I'm learning myself here.
Oh, okay, gotcha. Okay. Well, that's what I can tell is that people like Craig Planting and different people want to maintain that if God is a person, because the Bible seems to say he's a person, he has a will. He uses the words I and my and me like persons do. So to be personal would mean we have to deny the classical attributes of, say, God being timeless and unchangeable and that kind of thing. And we're here to, as classical theists, we say, no, we still maintain this. God is still personal even with these attributes.
Yeah. Interesting. Well, it's something I would like to find myself thinking more about in the future. Although, as I mentioned, I'm a doctoral student, so I've got to work on finishing that up, my area first before delving into other fields.
Well, it's a lifetime of learning. You'll never get there. It's this lifetime of stuff.
That's right. Yeah. Wow. Well, I know this has been a very heady program on today's episode, but. Brian, I want to thank you so much for taking time out of your day to help us understand what classical theism is, what are some of these doctrines, and why it's important as well, because these beliefs find their way into the everyday conversations that we have with people.
That's right. They're not just heady philosophical things, or have very pastoral issues associated with them as well.
Yeah, that's right. And so it's good for folks to become educated and learn and think more about these things, so that way they can grow as a disciple of Jesus, and so then they can also take what they've learned and share it with others, and in the apologetic context, to be able to persuade people and to respond to those that just won't believe, those that continue to object. So thank you so much for coming on today's program.
Thanks for having me. I really enjoyed it. Appreciate it.
Of course. And if you want to learn more about Dr. Huffling, you can go to his website, brianhuffling.com, and we're going to put that link on our website as well. So if you want to click over to that in a couple days, you can get a link, easily goes to his website. Great. So before we end today's program, I've got two things I want to talk about. I shared this article from the New York Times. U.S. fertility rate fell to a record low for a second straight year. And I shared this on the Veracity Hill social media, and it got a lot of comments from folks, a bit more interaction than I had thought. And John Appleton, bless his soul. So he writes in, Kurt, I'm doing my part. We have 5 kids. Do I need to step it up? So, of course, that was met by a couple folks. Michaela wrote, 7 is the number of perfection. So, so John, I think you've met the quota. The big concern here is the average. And so, there are more and more couples that are choosing to forego having kids, or folks just aren't, getting married and having children. It's really a complicated issue, and this rate, this statistic, I think, is an indicator of multiple problems in our society today. I have said here that on the page that I'm a Lockean, so I think that the family is the fundamental building block of a society. So I'm a Lockean with regard to political philosophy, and so I think the traditional marriage really provides the foundation for a flourishing society. And so when children are born to the mother and father in that stable relationship, that teleological relationship, that God-designed relationship, that's a good thing, and that leads to a flourishing of society. I appreciate some of the other comments here that note about, Lindsay writes in here, the phobia of responsibility, the love of wealth, the worship of self, and that this is, in a sense, he even says, the hate of children. It really is a difference, viewing children as a burden or a blessing. And when we view children as burdens, we're going to be less likely to have them and to care for them. But when we view children as blessings, as they really are, that leads to a flourishing life. And so I want to encourage those out there to consider how valuable it is to have a flourishing society and to have a personally flourishing life as well. I think children provide a lot of the meaning and life experiences that one can really appreciate. I know for me, when I had my first child, I really experienced for the first time unconditional love. There is nothing that child did to earn my love, and I wanted to just show and pour out my love for that human being. With all other relationships, you think, oh, there's even something that you're getting in return. But for the first time, you really experience that unconditional love. And that's something I never would have experienced. Now, of course, I'm not saying that everyone should have children. Some people shouldn't. Some people cannot. And those, I think, are sometimes sad situations. But nevertheless, I think when we're talking about the general rules, the general principles for a flourishing society, I think that having many children is a good sign of a flourishing society. So I want to thank those that tuned in to the article there that I posted online. Thanks for your comments and for sharing that as well, some of you. All right, one last thing. Next week, we're doing a casual fundraiser. So if you live in the Chicagoland area and you would like to join me and others from the Defenders Media team at Cozy Mel's, I think that's how it's said, Cozy Mel's Mexican Grill in Wheaton, Illinois, next Saturday, 6 to 8 p.m. I would love it if you came and joined us. It's just going to be a great opportunity. I'll be giving about a 20-minute presentation on the need for apologetics in our country and what Defenders Media is doing to help fulfill that need. And so you'll hear about some great opportunities, ways that you might be able to give, and an interesting opportunity from a realtor who's offering the chance for his commission to go to Defenders Media. So if you are in the area, it's free food. You have to RSVP, so you can go to the Defenders Media website and you can RSVP. Seating is limited, but I did want to get this invitation out there to those that might be able to make it. And I hope that you will give that consideration. So that does it for today's program. I'm grateful for the continued support that we have with our patrons. Those are folks that just chip in a couple bucks each month. If you'd like to become a patron, you can go to the website veracityhill.com, click on the patron tab there. We would love to get your support. You help things like the VR50 come into our office, and will improve what we do week after week. I'm also grateful for the partnerships that we have with our sponsors: Defenders Media, Consult Kevin, The Sky Floor, Rethinking Hell, the Illinois Family Institute, Fox Restoration, and Nonprofit Megaphone. I want to thank our technical producer, Chris, today. A fine job. Chris, I hope you did well with today's program and with the new VR50. And last but not least, I want to thank our guest, Brian Huffling, for coming on and enlightening us about the doctrines of classical theism and how that really can help us in our lives. But last but not least, I certainly want to thank you for listening in and for striving for truth on faith, politics, and society.
You've been listening to Veracity Hill, striving for truth on faith, politics, and society. This is a listener-supported program. For more resources, including past shows, visit veracityhill.com.